Today I'm going to demonstrate a few concepts that form the foundation of Angular app development. Now here in my browser, I have a Angular app that's running locally on port 4500. And I'd like to take note of a couple of things. Here I have a title on the page. I have a greeting, Hello Mike 2020. Then I have two functionalities here, which are errands and themes. And now using this setup, I'm going to demonstrate the concepts that I mentioned earlier. So without further ado, let's get to our first concept, Angular modules. So what is an Angular module? Angular modules provide a compilation context for components. At the very least, every Angular application has one root module, conventionally called the app module, which provides a bootstrap mechanism that launches application. So there are two types of modules, two types of Angular modules. You have the root module, which is conventionally called the app module. Then we have feature modules. So the root module is responsible for assembling everything that the app needs when the app is starting up. So when the Angular application starts up, it looks for the Angular root module, which contains declarations for components, other modules that you've imported, providers like services, and it strings all those together to create the app or to launch the app. Feature modules allow us to group related functionality together. In the example that I showed earlier, we had several modules. We had the errands module, which grouped errands related logic together. We had the Teams module, then we also had a greetings module. So what this does is in most web UI applications or in most Angular applications, the logic can get quite complex. So instead of having one monolith of an application, you want to break it up into coherent units, in this case modules, so that the application is easier to maintain and so that we can also reuse that functionality elsewhere if need be. In addition, modules help us take advantage of lazy loading functionality in Angular, which is something I'll touch upon when I demo. But this essentially means that instead of loading all the modules on startup all together, we only load the modules when they are needed. So basically loading the modules on demand. So here we're looking at our root module, which in this case is named the app module. That's a default name that Angular gives it. And the root module, as you remember, is responsible for bootstrapping the Angular application when it starts. So here we see a couple of things. We see a declaration here for the app component, and we see some imports. So the imports here are other modules. We have the browser module, which is a Angular provided module. We have app routing module that's responsible for routing capabilities. So when someone navigates or clicks on a link, the app routing module handles that. Then you have the greeting module, which is responsible for displaying this, Hello Mike 2020. And then if you see, we have here a for root, and then we pass in a configuration. So what for root does is that it allows us to override certain properties in the module. So in this case, I'm overriding the username property in the for root module. Sorry, in the greeting module. So if I didn't have this, the greeting module has a default property. So if I didn't provide this, if I got rid of for root, came in here and it reloads, you see it has this default property, default user, but I'm overriding that default user property by providing my own username. So that's an example of how you can override properties in modules. And then you have the errands module, which is the default or the landing page that we land on when we navigate to the home page. So when index.html is hit in the routing module, I defined a property that said when you land on the root of the page, navigate to the errands component, and that's why we load this errands module when the app module itself loads, because we know that that's something that's going to be hit definitely by everyone that hits the page, as opposed to other modules that won't be hit immediately. And for those ones, we would want to have them as lazy loaded modules, because let's say you have 100 modules in your app. You don't want to load all of them at the same time. You want to load the essential ones in this app root, and then all the other ones that we feel like users will probably hit, then we want to load those lazily or on demand. We also have a providers key here, or providers array. And this is usually used to supply services, but I don't have any services in the root module. Then you have the bootstrap array as well. And this here we see has the app component. And this is what is loaded when we hit the homepage, index.html. Let's look at feature modules. If you go back to the web page, you can see a couple of things stand out. We have a greeting, we have an errands list, we have a teams list that contains a form that allows us to add teams to the form. So how do we represent this as modules in Angular? Remember, modules are coherent units of functionality, of code that perform the same functionality. So in this case, we want to have a greeting module that contains a greeting code. We want to have an errands module for the errands code, then have teams module for the teams code. So let's start with the greeting module. The greeting module pretty much has the same structure as a root module that we looked at earlier. It has an ng module annotation that contains a bunch of parameters. You have a declarations key here, and this declares the components, directives, pipes that belong to the module. In this case, we only have components. So we're saying this greeting component belongs to the greeting module. We have an exports key here that declares a greeting component as well. And what this does is that it makes the greeting component template public so that other modules or other templates can use it. So if you go into our root module, you have the app component HTML, and as you can see, it has an app greeting selector, and this is defined in the app component, in the greeting component code. So if you come in here, you can verify that this is a greeting component, and it declares the app greeting selector. So by exporting the greeting component, we're also making that app greeting selector public so that other templates, like the app component template that you just saw, can use it. So next, let's look at the errands module, which is quite similar to the greeting module that you just looked at. It has a ng module annotation with a declaration saying that the errands component belongs to this module. Then you have an imports that pulls in the modules that we'd like to use. This is a common module that comes baked in with Angular. Then we have a custom errands routing module, which contains code for the navigation logic related to errands. So on this page, when I come and click errands, that triggers the errands routing module, which has the logic for saying, hey, if you hit the errands path, which is this, then redirect the errands component. And the errands component has a template which will display the list of errands. The teams module is similar to the errands module we just saw. It has an ng module annotation that has a declarations array where we declare the teams component, and this teams component is responsible for rendering this list as well as this form. It also has an imports array where we define all the modules that we'd want to use in this teams module. So we want to use the teams routing module, the forms module, and the common module. Forms module and common module are Angular specific modules, or in other words, they come with Angular. Then teams routing module is similar to the errands routing module that we saw. It's just a custom module that I wrote for this tutorial. And then we also have a providers array where we declare a service, in this case, a team service. And this doesn't do much, it just populates an array. And if this method or this function is called, it returns that array. So nothing too special going on there. So next, let's look at the other concept that would be essential for you to be familiar with when you're working with the Angular framework. And that concept is components. Components are essentially responsible for views. When you open an Angular web app and the view is displayed, the view that you see is powered by components. And every Angular application has at least one component, that is the root component. And conventionally, it's named the app component. So here what we're looking at is the app component, which is the root component. And the way we know that it's a root component, if you wanted to verify, is to come to the app module and look in the bootstrap field, and we see it as the app component defined in that array. So let's just run down the app component itself. So we have a component annotation, which is a selector. This selector is what you'd want to use in your HTML templates if you want to use this component HTML template. The template URL maps to an HTML file. So a template is essentially a HTML file that is a mix of regular HTML and Angular type HTML. Style URLs maps to some CSS files. So in this case, you want some CSS to style your component file or your template file. You put that CSS in here. Now, how does this work? So when the index HTML file is loaded, remember the index HTML file is loaded only once because Angular is a single page application. So when it's loaded, the app root is rendered. And remember, the app root corresponds to this app component HTML as defined in here. So when that is loaded, then it's going to render this HTML, which is the app greeting that we saw in the greeting module. There's a component there, the greeting component. And then we have, A tags, a router outlet. So this router outlet is important because it's a placeholder that gets replaced when you navigate to a specific URL or when you route to a specific URL. So next, let's look at the other component that we have in this tutorial, which is the greeting component. So the greeting component is responsible for displaying this greeting here that says Hello Mike 2020, as well as its title. So if you come in the greeting component, you see that it maps to, it has an app greeting selector, and that maps to this template. And if you go into that template, you see that it has the title as a header, which you just saw, and an ngIf directive that checks if a user exists. So if the user is not empty, and if the user is not null, then this hello user will be printed. Otherwise, it will not be printed. Now back to the greeting component. You'll notice that it has a user field that's by default empty, but then we have a user service that gets injected when the app is loaded. And then we take the username from that user service and assign it to this user. So if you go into the user service, you'll notice that we have a user configuration inner class. So we define another class inside this service. Usually we want to define such classes outside, but since this tutorial is quite simple, I just define it in here for simplicity. And this class has a username, which by default is empty. And then the user service is injectable. That's why it's injected into the greeting component. And it has a username default, which is a default user. And then we also have here the user configuration. And if that config exists, then the username will be assigned to the username in this user service will be assigned to the username from the config. And then when you call the user service username, which is what we do here. So when you call this username, we're essentially calling this function, then it will return the username, either default user or whatever is specified in here. So where does this user configuration get set? So let's go into the app module, and you'll see here that you have a for root, and this username that we see here corresponds to the username that we saw in the user service, which is this username. So what we're doing here is we're assigning the value Mike 2020 to the username in the user service config. And if you go into for root, we'll see that. So we have user service configuration. So behind the scenes, it does all that. It assigns the username to Mike 2020. And then here we return the ng module, which is the greeting module that corresponds to this. So we're returning a module with providers. So we're returning the greeting module and saying it has providers. And in this case, we only have one provider, which is the user service configuration. And the value we want to use is whatever we passed in for root. So this. And that's why when we load the page, we'll see Mike 2020 because that's what was passed in to the for root. If we get rid of this, we get hello default user because there was no config provided. And so the user service provided the default username, which is default user. So since we took out the for root, there was no config that was provided. So this check failed. And then this username just ended up being default user, which was displayed here. So let's look at the other components that we have in this example. So we just looked at the greeting component. And so we'll go ahead and look at the errands component as well as a teams component. So remember the errands component was defined in the module here. And so we come in here and click on it, and it takes us to this file. And you can see that here we have an errands component TypeScript file that has a component annotation. And the component annotation has some metadata in here. We have a selector named app errands. So this app errands would be a selector or an element that we use if we use this app component in another template on another HTML file. But for this example, we're not going to do that. So I just added this here for completeness. So we have a template URL, which points to the template file, which is just an HTML file. In this case, it's this guy right here. And then we have a style URLs, which points to some, it's supposed to point to some CSS files, but in this case, it's pointing to this CSS file, but I have nothing in there because I'm lazy. But I just added this here as well for completeness sake. So that is what the component, the errands component TypeScript file looks like. So if we move into the template itself, we see we have this, and the template essentially is a combination of regular HTML with the H5, with the div, with the P, and the Angular markup. So we have ng4, we have this let, we have let of errand, we're iterating, we have the interpolation here. So that's basically what a template is, a combination of HTML and Angular markup. In this case, our my errands is this header right here, and then we have this div ends up rendering to this. Okay, so now let's move on to the teams component. So same thing, let's go to the teams module, teams component. We have the same thing of a selector, app teams. I'm not using this in any other HTML template. So just for completeness, style URL, same thing. I don't have any URLs there, but if you had styling for your template, you put it in there. Then I've got the template URL. So this is what I'm interested in, this template file. So if you come here to the template file itself, we see it has the same thing. It's a mix of HTML, regular HTML, and Angular markup. We have a for ng4. We have some interpolation here. We have a team reference, and then we have a form as well. So this template is representative of this view that we see. So you have the list here, then you have the form here. This is the form that we're seeing. So now, if you come to the backend component, we see that we have a team service that gets the teams, and the team is just an array, and the array gets returned here, and this is the method that returns the array when you call the team service. So if you go back to the component TypeScript, we see we call team service.teams, which calls this method. So it just returns the array. And then we have an add team method. And if you go back to the HTML, we see you have an add team right here. So if you submit, once you click this button here, you see it's of type submit, you click add team, it's going to trigger this method and submit the form to this method right here, and then populate this team, which is just an empty team that we have right here. Populate the team, push it to the array, and the array, this teams, comes back up here, and this teams references here. So it'll push that team into this array, and then re-render this page or this section with that new team. So all that to say, the component and the HTML work hand in hand. So whatever you have in the HTML and you trigger back into the component TypeScript, you can work in the TypeScript and push those changes back to the HTML. So that's the power of Angular. So here I'm just going to demo how you can add a team to the teams array that I just showed moments ago. This here is a list of Champions League winners in the last 5 years. So I'll go ahead and add one more. And boom, you see it'll add it to the list, and automatically the list was refreshed. So if you come here into the code itself, you see here we pushed when you say add team. When you come in here, this is the form. We add the team, comes through here. The team is pushed to the array. This teams references this array. This array references this. This references the teams in here. This teams references this array. So we just added that team to this array, and automatically the changes were picked up by Angular and displayed in the browser. Okay, next, let's talk about services. A service is typically a class with a narrow, well-defined purpose. It should do something specific and do it well. Now, where we really see services shining is when we're working components, because components should be kept lean and only concern themselves with displaying the views. For any logic that's not associated with a specific view and that you want to reuse and share among components, then you should use services. A component can delegate certain tasks to services, such as fetching data from the server, validating user input, or logging directly to the console. By defining such processing tasks in an injectable service class, you make those tasks available to any component. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at some services that are defined in our demo application. Here I have the errand service open, and we can see that it has an errands array, which gets returned when the get errands method is called. Now, typically errand services will call an external, typically services will call an external service, could be a login service, could be a API. But for this example, instead of calling an API, I just mimicked the API call by declaring an errands array, and that's what gets returned. So when we call the get errands method here, we subscribe, and when the callback comes in, we assign the errands data from the call to this errands property, which gets displayed in the template by iterating over the errands array. One thing I wanted to mention was this injectable annotation that we have here. Now, this makes this class a candidate for dependency injection. And dependency injection is a technique in which an object receives other objects that it depends on. So in our case, the errands component depends on the errands service because it needs to call an external service, in this case an array, but usually like an API, needs to call an external service to get data. And so instead of defining all that logic in the component, we designate that to our service, and then we inject that service as a dependency because we need that service to get the data. So that's where the injectable comes in. Likewise, when you go to team service, we have the same thing. Injectable, it's a team service, we have the arrays. And if you come to the teams component, it depends on that team service because that's what it needs to fetch the data when you call teams. Now, once you have the services declared, we'll have to make them available to the app. So in our case, since we're using modules, if you go to the errands module, we see we declare the errand service in the providers. So typically you would define your services in the providers array. So here we have the errand service, and you define it in the providers for the errands module. And then when we go to the team service, to the team module, we have the team service defined in the providers array for the teams module. So what we're saying here is that the services basically take responsibility for the heavy lifting aspects of the application and take that away from the component. So instead of a component declaring um, all that external logic in here, we designate that to the service, and the service handles that. And the service is reusable. So if I want to reuse this team service somewhere else, if I want to get teams data somewhere else, I can just inject this into that component and use it, as opposed to like trying to write the logic again. Routing involves navigation to the right view. This happens when the URL is typed in the browser or from an event such as clicking a link in the view or by using the back and forward browser buttons. The router maps URL-like paths to views instead of pages. In a single page app, you change what the user sees by showing or hiding portions of the display that correspond to particular components, rather than going out to the server to get a new page. So in apps that are not single page, you have to go to the server to fetch the page and then have it rendered in the browser, as HTML and have the display show. Not so with single page apps like Angular. You just show and hide the particular portions of the page that you need or don't need. As users perform application tasks, they need to move between the different views that you have defined. To handle the navigation from one view to the next, we use the Angular router. The router enables navigation by translating a browser URL as an instruction to change the view. So let's have a look at how routing works. Here, I'm on the teams view. As you can see, I'm on the teams path and I'm seeing a list of teams. However, if I go to the root and don't define a path, the path is empty, just local 4500. Then I get redirected to the errands page, to the errands view. How does this work? Let's have a look. So we have the app component here, and the app component. Remember, the app component is the root component that's responsible for bootstrapping the application and providing it with all that it needs to start up. And among the things that it needs is the app routing module, and in the app routing module, we have the definition of routes. In our case, when the path is empty, we redirect to the errands component. And how does this module know where to go? Remember, we had the errands module, and in the errands module, we had the errands routing module, which is where we define all the paths that are related to the errands functionality. In our case, we have the errands path that maps the errands component, which is the backing component for this HTML template for errands, and that's what you see in the browser. So that's how that happens. Now, another concept I wanted to highlight here is the router outlet, which is this element right here. So the router outlet is a placeholder that gets replaced by the template of the path that you navigate to. So in our case, we navigated to the errands component, which rendered the errands component HTML. So this errands component HTML basically came and replaced that router outlet element. Similarly, when you navigate to the teams view, the same thing happens. So this HTML that's rendered simply replace this line 5 here, and that HTML came from the teams component HTML. So that's a good component. That's a good concept to know or to grasp, because it's useful when you're creating a single page application to know that the router outlet element is simply a placeholder for the templates for the paths that you navigate to. Another component that I really wanted to talk about was the lazy loading versus eager loading. So eager loading just means that we're loading the components all at once, while lazy loading means that you load them on demand. Now, you want to do eager loading for the components that you know are frequently used or are most likely to be used. In our case, we know that the home page navigates the errands path, and so the errands component will be used by everyone that lands on the landing page. So we know that the errands component should be eagerly loaded. And so how we do that is we come back to the app routing module, we see that we directly define the errands component by redirecting to it. However, for the Teams view, perhaps there's some users who will not even land on the Teams page. So we don't want to waste resources by loading the Teams page if you know that some users or majority of the users might not end up landing on the Teams view. So for Teams, we end up lazy loading it. And the way we do it is that we load the children of the module, but only load them when the path Teams is activated. So when someone navigates the path Teams, then we load the component, which ends up rendering the Teams view. So that's an important concept to know about, because especially when you're dealing with complex applications that have a multitude of routes and components, you don't want to load everything unnecessarily. You want to load the things that are most important, the things that will be most likely to be used eagerly, and then everything else that's pretty much optional or users that are not likely to use, you want to load those on demand. So in this tutorial, we covered some basic yet fundamental concepts of Angular, which are modules, components, services, and routing. Having a good understanding of these concepts will make your life easy as you navigate the Angular development world. And while Angular has a lot more functionality than what I just covered, I believe having a good grasp of these concepts will make your life way, way easy as you develop, because they form the foundational building blocks of Angular applications. Thank you for watching.